Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's session of Economics and Society webinar series brought to you by Students for Liberty Europe and the Economics, the Foundation for Economic Education. I'm Vinayakan, and I'm honored to be your host for this discussion. Tonight, we have a thought-provoking topic that challenges some widely held assumptions. Was Jesus a socialist? And to guide us through this conversation, we are privileged to have with us Lawrence W. Reed. Larry Reed is a leading voice in free market economics and a passionate historian of liberty. As President Emeritus of Foundation for Economic Education, he has spent decades researching, writing, and speaking about economic principles, history, and moral foundations of free society. He has traveled to over 90 countries and authored numerous works, including Was Jesus a Socialist, the subject of today's talk. In this session, Mr. Reed will explore whether Jesus' teaching aligns with socialist ideals, what historical and economic evidences suggest, and how we can better understand intersection of faith and economics. As always, feel free to drop in your questions in the Q&A session. Q&A box available, and we will address as many as possible during the Q&A session at the end. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lawrence W. Reed. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Vinayakan, and also to Jan and to Students for Liberty. I look forward to seeing many of you at the conference in Prague at the end of April. If you haven't yet looked into that, I hope you will and sign up for it. Should be a lot of fun that last weekend of the month of April. Well, we're going to talk about the matter of Jesus and whether or not he was a socialist today. And I always like to begin by saying it shouldn't matter whether you are a person of faith or of what faith or no faith to take an interest in this subject, because we all have an interest in truth. And when someone says to you, well, you should be a socialist for many reasons, one of them is that Jesus was one. I think you should be able to now, after this talk, to come back and say that's not true, because, and that's my focus here today, not to proselytize for any particular faith, though I am a very proud Christian myself, but rather to simply look at this question from the point of view of economics and political science and evidence, what the actual evidence suggests. This question really hinges greatly upon the matter of what socialism is. And you probably have noticed that a lot of socialists don't even seem to know clearly what it is. They differ among themselves. Sometimes it's very superficially advanced as a philosophy of helping people. It's compassion. Socialism is doing good things for people, as opposed to capitalism, which is supposed to be, focused on oneself and personal greed, and many other epithets have come its way over the years. But I have to tell you that socialism is not simply good intentions. It isn't simply the desire to be compassionate, because you can possess those things in any system. And there's good evidence to suggest that the freest of economies produces more things like compassion and sympathy and people helping people and solving problems than socialism does. So socialists really need to get their act together to begin with, just in defining what this is. Mikhail Gorbachev, the late Soviet leader, famously said, and this is a direct quote, Jesus was the first socialist because he was the first to seek a better life for mankind. Now think of that. Jesus was the first socialist because he was the first to seek a better life for mankind. Well, first of all, I doubt that he was the first to seek a better life for mankind. But more to the point, if that's all socialism is, just seeking a better life for mankind, well, I guess we're all socialists. I mean, how meaningful can that be? If you offer that as any kind of a definition. And then you have a lot of people who call themselves socialists who skip around from one example of it to another, usually rejecting all the previous ones and saying, well, we'll get it right the next time. You saw this with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. There were a lot of people around the world who said, here we have socialism. Finally, we're going to get it right. And as they do so often, when it flopped, then they said, well, no, that wasn't socialism after all. And so they'll move on then most of the time to giving it another whirl for the 10,000th time, and never really learning much from the previous experiences. That's unfortunately the case. Well, let me give you a clearer idea as to what socialism is. I think there's a single word that defines or sums up the essence of socialism better than any other word I can think of, and that is force. Force. This is so much a part, an inseparable part of what socialism is all about, that I would go so far to say, if it's voluntary, then it's not socialism. Socialism is the use of force. In fact, to give you a little bit of a wordy definition, let me say that it's the concentration of political and economic power in the state, in the hands of the state, to achieve one or two or all of the objectives that I will share with you here in a moment. It's the concentration of power. It isn't just happy words and good feelings and sharing things and gaining consent from others to do something. All of that you can do under capitalism, and you do a lot more of it there than you do under any other system. But socialism concentrates political and economic power in the hands of the state. And for what purpose? Here are some objectives of socialism. And I readily concede that different socialists will emphasize one point maybe over another. Consider that as you consider these objectives. What does socialism attempt to achieve by concentrating political and economic power? Well, one objective is the central planning of an economy. And to some socialists, that's the key to everything. They really emphasize it. We want the government to plan an economy. And they often say that if government doesn't do that, well, then you have chaos. Then you have a marketplace that isn't run by anybody. And they think that's chaotic. They have it in their mind that the king or the parliament or whoever the dictator is has to run other people's lives because they won't know what to do if they're not told what to do. The central planning of the economy, that's a socialist objective. Another one is government ownership of the means of production. And, there are a lot of socialists today who will say, well, no, we won't go that far. We don't want that. We think there's a role for the private sector. We don't want the government to own everything. But historically, from Karl Marx on, with the more ideological socialists, government ownership of the means of production has been a key objective. And they don't always want to do it by actual outright ownership. Sometimes they'll say, well, we'll leave industry in private hands, but we will give them orders. We'll tell them what to do. Then it raises the question, of course, well, if they simply are there to follow orders, who really owns it? Effectively, the government does if they're running the show and giving all the orders. Another objective of socialism is the redistribution of wealth. And that's probably the most sought after socialist objective today among socialists. They don't focus so much as they used to on the ownership by government of property, but they want to redistribute it, and they want to use government to get that done. And I used to, when I gave this talk, sort of say those are the three main objectives and move on. But then I had people in the audience say, well, no, you missed another objective. We as socialists want to see workers controlling the work sites where they work, owning the work sites where they work. And so sometimes I add that. I should make some mention of it. But keep in mind, you can do that today under a capitalist system. If workers want to get together and say, hey, let's put in a bid to buy the company where we work, they're free to do that. And sometimes it happens. It's called employee stock ownership plans and by other names. Or workers can get together, pool their capital, and create a company. You can do that now. But what socialists usually mean when they refer to this is that they want the workers to seize the place of work. They want or government to seize it on their behalf and then let them run it. That raises all kinds of questions like, well, why should they have the right to do that? And if they do, why shouldn't somebody have the right to come and take their property? But in any event, those are the objectives to one degree or another, with different socialists emphasizing one over another of those objectives. Those are what socialism seeks to do. Now, the question is, was Jesus in any way sympathetic to socialism as I've defined it? Did he express sympathy with any of those objectives? It's important to point out that I think this is a great virtue of socialism's opposite, which is capitalism, in that there are some ways in which under capitalism you can practice socialism if you want. Like I say, you can gather together some workers and buy a company or create one. Or you can, to the socialists who think redistribution of income to achieve more economic equality is important, well, they can do that now. They can go up and down their street and knock on doors and say, hey, everybody, let's put all of our earnings into a common storehouse, and then we'll distribute it equally to each of us. I mean, you're free to do that. Good luck. You're not likely to get any takers, but you can do that. But under socialism, you can't practice capitalism, typically, unless the socialist authorities decide to give you permission. If you say in a socialist country to the government, oh, well, thank you for all the programs you're offering me and all the this or that. If you say to the government, thanks anyway, but I'd prefer not to partake of that, usually they don't say, oh, that's all right, because they're not about voluntary consent. They're about compulsion. When I first heard years ago as a teenager that Jesus was in some way a socialist, I had problems right away with that. I kept thinking, wait a minute, everywhere I look around the world, I see socialism. Those who call themselves socialists or those we know are socialists, whether they admit it or not, these are places where people are being pushed around, where their stuff is being taken, where dictators are in charge, where force is applied to so many aspects of life. I couldn't, with what I knew of the message of Christ, I couldn't square that. I thought, how can you say he was a socialist? There's no instance of him calling for the government to do anything. And yet that's what a lot of socialists would have you believe. In fact, you can scour the New Testament and you will not find a single word from the mouth of Jesus in which he endorses the political redistribution of wealth, the concentration of power, the government ownership of the tools and means of production, none of that stuff. In fact, Jesus made the point more than once that he came to fulfill the law, as he put it, not to overcome it. And by the law, he was referring to the Ten Commandments. And I would remind you that the eighth of the Ten Commandments says, thou shalt not steal. It does not say, thou shalt not steal unless the other guy has more than you do. It doesn't say, thou shalt not steal unless you are absolutely convinced you could spend it better than the person who earned it. And it doesn't say, thou shalt not steal, but it's okay to hire a politician to do it on your behalf. It says, thou shalt not steal, period. That's pretty powerful pro-private property, free market stuff in that one commandment. And then 2 commandments later, we have, thou shalt not covet. And or express envy toward your fellow men and women. I think that was God's way of saying, hey, you humans are always trying to find some way to, or some justification to take what doesn't belong to you. And you start usually by coveting the wealth of others. Well, don't do that. And socialism is rooted in covetousness, in envy. In fact, I've often thought, as I observe what socialists do when they have power, uh, they're always vilifying those who have more than they think they should have. And sometimes, people do get great wealth not because of willing consent, but because of their connections to government, getting special favors or subsidies. I'm against that too. That's not free market capitalism. Um, but by and large, uh, if you produce and invest and create, hire people, invent things, and you are successful at it because consumers like what you're doing, there's nothing in the New Testament that suggests that Jesus would condemn you in any way. He never said anything about whether or not I accept you or you're accepted ultimately into heaven is going to depend on your bank account. That's so counter to his message. Well, let's look at some of his own words. There's a passage in the book of Luke, Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 15, where a man approaches Jesus with a redistribution request. He says to Jesus, "Master, speak to my brother that he divideth the inheritance with me." In other words, he's saying, I think the other guy got more than me. That's not fair. Can you use your power or your influence, please, to redistribute the wealth? Take from him and give to me because I didn't get enough. Now, Jesus, if he was a redistributive socialist, probably would have said, "Oh my gosh, you didn't get the same, or you didn't. Oh, let me look into that. I'll get back to you. And if necessary, we'll have to take something from that other guy." He doesn't say that at all. Here's what he says. He says, "Man, who made me a judge or divider over you? Take heed and beware of covetousness." In other words, he says to the man, you've got your head in the wrong place. Don't ask me to swipe somebody else's property because you think, maybe you got a matter for the civil courts or something. I don't know, but I'm not going to do it. Don't ask me. I don't favor that sort of thing. Well, that's from the words of Jesus himself in Luke 12. Then you have the story of the Good Samaritan. It's one of almost 40 parables that Jesus told during his 3-year ministry. He often taught in the form of stories or parables in order to make a point that local people could relate to. And in this story, he recounts how a man is walking along a road and he comes upon another man who's been beaten up and robbed. He's laying there within an inch of his life. And what does the Samaritan do when he sees this man in need? He doesn't say to the man, "Oh, sorry, there must be a government program for you." Or, when I get to Rome, I'll tell the emperor about you and maybe he'll send somebody to help. No, if he did any of those things, we would not know him today as the Good Samaritan. We would think of him as the good for nothing Samaritan. We call him the Good Samaritan, however, because he decided of his own free will, using his own resources, to pitch in and help the man. All voluntary, nothing forceful here. He didn't call upon any government official. He helped the man himself freely and voluntarily. That's why he's a Good Samaritan. Jesus tells this story because he's tugging at your heart. He says, look, if you're in a situation where a person is in legitimate need and you can help them, it's a good idea to be compassionate. Maybe someday you'll be in similar need and you'll be glad that the other guy helped you. So that's not a case for socialism, and yet I've been presented with that argument. I've had people say to me, "Mr. Reed, you're opposed to the welfare state, but what about the Good Samaritan story? Doesn't that suggest that we should have welfare programs?" Not at all. Government is not involved in that parable in any way, shape, or form. Another parable that Jesus told was called the parable of the talents. A talent at that time was, we think of it today, as a skill or a particular attribute that you have that you're good at. But a talent in the sense of this parable was a unit of money. And as Jesus tells this story, it involves an estate owner who calls three of his workers together and he says, I'm going away for a time, and I would like to trust each of you with a portion of some of my wealth. And you take care of it. And when I get back, we'll reassemble and you can tell me what you did with it. And so he gives three different quantities to each to these three people. And then he comes back later. And in this parable, Jesus has the estate owner saying to the three workers, okay, what did you do with what I trusted you with? And the first man says, oh, master, you'll be happy with me. I buried it in the backyard. And so I have just as much as you trusted me with. Well, he gets condemned by the owner. He says, what? I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says, what? How could you not do anything with it? You're worthless. So then he says to the second man, what did you do? And the second man says, oh, I magnified it. I invested it. I found some good things to do with it. And now, sir, I have 3 or 4 or 5 times what you trusted me with. He gets praised in the parable. And then the third guy is asked the same question, and he says, oh my gosh, I have 10 times what you trusted me with. He's the one that Jesus has the estate owner praising the most. And in fact, he goes one step further and he says, let's take the money from the first guy who clearly didn't know what to do with it and give it to this third guy because he knows how to magnify wealth. So Jesus actually is praising the creator of wealth, not the person who just sat on it and didn't do anything with it. That's hardly a case for socialism, and I don't think I need to tell you why. It's pretty obvious. Well, then you have another parable called the parable of the talents. I'm sorry, of the workers, parable of the workers in the vineyard. And this involves a man who owns a vineyard calling a group of workers together at the first light of day. And he says, the grapes are ready. I need you each to go out and bring in as many grapes as you can. And if you do, at the end of the day, I'll give you each a denarius, which is another a coin or unit of money. And well, then around noontime, with half the workday gone, the owner realizes I need more workers in the field to get all the grapes in. So he calls another group together and he says, if you will work the rest of the day bringing grapes in, I will give you each a denarius. And then very late in the day, with maybe an hour of light to go, the owner calls another group of workers together, desperate to get the grapes in. And he says to this group, you may only need to work an hour, but I need you to go pick grapes. And if you do that for me, I'll give you each a denarius. Well, then Jesus has the workers gather afterwards to be paid. And as you might imagine, the ones who worked all day for the same amount that those who worked only an hour, they're kind of angry. They're saying, oh my gosh, how come those guys got just as much as me and they only worked an hour or 4 hours instead of the 8 or 10 that I worked? And Jesus has the vineyard owner respond to them by saying, it's my money. Wow, talk about a capitalist statement. He says, it's my money. Didn't I give each of you what I promised for what you promised to do? I was faithful to the contract that I made with each of you. Quit complaining. It's my money. I can do with it what I want. If I have to pay workers a lot more than others in order to get some work done, that's between me and them, not you. You can't get much more capitalist than that. That's a defense of the sanctity of contract. It's a defense of private property. And I think it's probably even a defense of supply and demand, because it's not hard to imagine that at the end of the day, with so many workers already having worked and looking forward to staying home for the evening, you probably have to pay a little extra to get them to get back out and do some more work. So there are a lot of things at work there. Socialism is not one of them. Well, then you have the famous line that Jesus uttered that socialists love. And that is when the Pharisees approach him They're trying to trick him. They were always trying to trick him. They want to get him to say something or do something that they can run to the Roman authorities with and say, look, he's preaching subversion. You know, he needs to be arrested. And so the Pharisees produced a coin with the image on it of Caesar, and they wanted to know, what do we do with this coin? And they wanted to catch him expressing sympathy for tax evasion. But Jesus very cleverly responded with this line. He said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God that which is God's. Now, let me ask you, does that prescribe the size of government? Does that say anything about how big government should be or should not be? No, you could be an anarchist and like what he didn't say that anything belonged to Caesar. He just says, if it does, well, then give it to him. But if it doesn't, don't feel obligated to. That's basically what he's saying here. This is not some justification for government taxing to any degree that it wants. I mean, some socialists think that. They say, see, whatever the government wants, Jesus is saying, pay your taxes. He left the issue of how big government should be to us. Okay, and needless to say, societies have been all over the place on that issue ever since and long before. He didn't say, he would never say, if Caesar wants it, it's his, no matter how much he wants. Even if he wants everything you've got, even if it leaves you starving. If Caesar says, I want it, it's his. And he would never say, and whatever he wants to spend it on, it's his. I mean, if you know anything about Jesus's teachings, you know he could never say that. He could never justify the kind of misuse of other people's money that governments often engage in. And so socialists really take that line far beyond its real meaning. Well, the socialists love to point to this. Here's another example of scripture taken out of context. It involves a rich ruler. In fact, if in one of the books of the New Testament, he's simply referred to as a rich man. It's in a later book that the same man is identified as also being a ruler. He was a politician. But this man approached Jesus and essentially said, how do I get in on your circle here? How do I get eternal life and be a part of your following? Well, Jesus, being who he was, knew the man's heart. And so he decided, obviously, to test him. He says, oh, okay, well, sell everything you've got and follow me. Socialists love to say, see, Jesus wants everybody to sell everything they have. And follow. No, he was talking to one person. And that one person responded rather quickly by saying, oh, no, I didn't mean you meant that. No, I can't do that. See you later. And then Jesus turns to a disciple who's standing next to him, and he says, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. Now, socialists say, okay, well, see, he's condemning riches and rich people. It's so hard for them to get it, to go through the eye of a needle. And just as hard then to go to heaven. Well, why did Jesus say that? Was he saying, whether you get to heaven depends on the size of your bank account? I don't think so. That accounts for, that would run counter to everything else he said. Jesus was saying, as he did in other contexts, don't let wealth go to your head. He didn't say don't earn wealth. He didn't say don't be productive. Don't trade with a lot of people and earn a lot of money willingly and voluntarily. He just said, don't worship wealth. Don't let it go to your head. Keep your priorities in proper order. You should control your wealth, not the other way around. That's what he was saying, and that's consistent with other things elsewhere in the New Testament that he said. And he would say the same thing about power, by the way. Socialists might not want you to know this, but he would say the same thing about power. Don't let that go to your head, because if it does, you will sully yourself you'll demean and diminish yourself, and you'll do great harm to others. Well, sometimes socialists say, well, what about the poor? Jesus was so concerned about the poor, and isn't that a sentiment that socialists share? Isn't that the reason we can say he was a socialist? Because he always wanted to help the poor. He never advocated doing it by force. He never said do it at gunpoint. He never said rob Peter to pay Paul. He never said take it from somebody and give it to the other guy. Never said vote for the politicians who promised to do that. Never said any of that. In fact, consider the case of the famous feeding of the 5,000. That's a story where there are 5,000 people who've gathered to hear Jesus speak, and they're very hungry. And one of the disciples turns to Jesus and says, "Oh, Master, what are we going to do? All these people want to hear what you have to say, but they're very hungry, and all we have are a few loaves of bread and a few fish. We don't have anywhere near what we need to feed these people." Well, Jesus responded, but he didn't say, "Oh, well, let's go find a neighborhood of rich people and take their stuff and bring it here and we'll feed the poor." Or let's go rob a grocery store. Or maybe let's call a politician in who can use the force of law to take stuff from people and give it to the poor here. Nothing like that. What Jesus did was to use his own unique power to magnify wealth, to magnify those fish and loaves. He didn't take anything from anybody. He magnified wealth and fed the 5,000. And can you imagine if Jesus came today with what you may know of his teaching, if he came back today and he spoke, well, let's say he spoke at the European Students for Liberty conference in Prague in late April, and he says to us at the conference, "Okay, you know, I said to be mindful of the poor. Now tell me, what did you do for them?" Do you think he would be impressed if any of us raised our hand and said, "Oh, well, I voted for the politicians who said they would take care of that"? I mean, come on. Jesus would more likely say, "What? I didn't say to take from anybody. I didn't say push the responsibility off onto politicians. I said, from the compassion of your heart, help if you can." In fact, the Apostle Paul, in one of his letters, I think to the Thessalonians, refers to the fact that God loves a cheerful giver. He didn't say God loves a coerced taxpayer. He said God loves a cheerful giver. And I don't think Jesus would be impressed if anybody from our audience would say, we took care of the poor by calling the politicians in and asked them to fix the problem. Well, then you have the story of the money changers in the temple. I've heard socialists say, well, you know what Jesus did with the money changers who were greedy capitalists? He drove them out of the temple. And they say, therefore, he must have been hostile to capitalists and moneymakers and so forth. But let me point out, where was this activity taking place? It was at the temple. There's every reason to believe that these money changers may have been disrupting services, or perhaps ripping people off, or making it seem as though to get into the temple you had to give them something. That's what Jesus was objecting to. If he was objecting to wealth and money making in general, he wouldn't have simply chased the money changers away from the temple. He'd be out there chasing them from marketplaces and from banks, but he never did. It was this one particular place because it was God's house. And what the money changers were engaging in on those holy premises was in violation of the spirit, if not the actuality of the law itself, of disrupting worshipful reverence of the Creator. So you have to consider where he did this and where he did not. He chased the money changers from the temple, not from a bank or from a marketplace. I'm working towards a conclusion here so as to give you 15, 20 minutes for questions, but a few more points. What about the question of greed? You have critics of capitalism and defenders of socialism say that, well, Jesus was against greed and therefore he would have problems with capitalism. And socialism, it stamps out greed. It doesn't like people who are in business just to make money. Socialism tries to prevent that. And so Jesus would be sympathetic. Well, there again, isn't it interesting, by the way? The socialists love to say that it's capitalists who are so concerned with money, and yet the socialists are always talking about money. They're always talking about other people's money. Everything they want to do involves taking other people's money. So who's more interested in money than socialists? You talk to a lot of capitalists, yeah, some of them are interested in creating wealth because it means riches for them, but an awful lot of them, they're in it for the personal fulfillment that comes from solving problems, from generating happy customers, from helping communities as philanthropists, and so forth. People like Elon Musk, yeah, he makes a lot of money, but don't you think that what is more animating to him and people like him is solving problems, going to Mars, doing things nobody's ever done before, conquering diseases and making life cheaper and better for more people. I mean, a lot of people who are entrepreneurs feel very fulfilled by those objectives. They don't accumulate wealth simply so they can sit in their basement and play with their gold coins. That's a caricature that doesn't really apply to many entrepreneurs or capitalists at all. But once again, Jesus would say, okay, yeah, you can take anything to an extreme. And if you take your desire for self-improvement to the point where you steal from others, or you use government to take things you can't get voluntarily in the marketplace, yeah, your greed has gone beyond the pale. Jesus wouldn't support that. But if you're simply accumulating wealth as a result of mutually beneficial and peaceful commerce, the invention of things, the hiring of people, the building of factories, the improvement of life, Jesus would say, wow, that's great, but don't let that wealth run you. Keep your priorities in order. Don't look at wealth as a god, and for all the obvious reasons. So greed, yeah, if you take it to the point where you're harming others using force or deception or fraud, well, of course, Jesus would be against that. But the mere desire to do better, you can't write that off as greed. That's what makes the world go round. That's what makes people make investments and take risks and solve problems in the process. That ends up lengthening and improving the lives of us all. Well, what about the phrase, money is the root of all evil? That's often pointed to by socialists. They're saying, well, capitalists worship money. We socialists are very skeptical of it because we know that Jesus said money is the root of all evil. Well, first of all, Jesus never said that. That was said by Paul, and that's not the complete phrase. What Paul actually said was, the love of money is the root of all evil. The love of money. What he's saying here is, if you put love of God second to love of wealth, if you focus your life on just piling up the gold coins, you've got your priorities in the wrong order. And that sort of thing leads to all kinds of harm. It leads to the desire to accumulate power because power means more money, that kind of thing. So there's a world of difference between the love of money and money itself. Jesus would never say money is the root of all evil. That's like saying, a medium of exchange that facilitates progress in an economy that's far better than barter, that somehow that's evil. I mean, he used money. My gosh, he was the recipient of gifts of money over his lifetime, gifts of, you can stay at my home tonight and that kind of thing. It's the love of money, not money itself, that Jesus and Christianity says to be wary of. Well, another point is I many times hear people say, well, but remember the early Christians, as described in the book of Acts, sold their belongings and shared the proceeds equally. And that therefore that's the way we should run our lives now 2,000 years later. Well, it's true that some Christians, not all by a long shot, in Jerusalem did practice this. They sold their possessions, or most of them, and put the proceeds in a common pot and shared equally. Why might they have done that? Well, one reason might have been they were the founders of a new faith that challenged traditional secular authorities. It was a very dangerous thing to do. There were plenty of people who were eager to point to something and say, see, you're a hypocrite or you're doing something wrong. Why should we follow you? Look what you're doing. They had a strong incentive to avoid even the slightest appearance of corruption. And so it's quite possible they thought, if we did that, then people can't condemn us for being in it for the money. Who knows? But in any event, Jesus never commanded this. This was some Christians chose to do it, and they did it voluntarily. The state was not involved in any way. In Paul's writings later, this is something that you never hear from a socialist. Paul actually complains that Christians in other places, like in Antioch and so forth, they have to keep sending funds back to the Christians in Jerusalem because they're always in need. They're always saying, send us money. And, as an economist, I can say, I can see that, because socialism is a flop everywhere it's tried. Because some people say, well, why do I have to work if I get just as much as the next guy? Well, it's interesting that Paul critiques the Christians in Jerusalem by saying we're always having to send them money. Maybe it was because they practiced socialism or a form of it for a time. But in any event, that died out. And probably 99% of Christians who've ever lived did not practice anything like that. The Pilgrims in America's early days practiced it for a time, about 2 or 3 years. And Governor Bradford of the Plymouth Colony said, we're going to stop that. We're starving. And so he said, we're going to go to private property because then you have an incentive to produce instead of just sit around and expect somebody else to give it to you. Well, finally, I'll just say that if you look at the various indexes that are produced every year by multiple sources around the world, indexes of economic freedom and indexes of economic wealth of one kind or another, you will find a powerful correlation between the freedom in economics and the prosperity of a people. The less freedom that people have in the economy, the less they're able to accumulate wealth, to produce, to invent, to take risks, to keep what they've earned, the more freedom to do those things, the better off people in general are. And at the other end of the scale, the places where they don't have those kinds of freedoms, like Cuba, North Korea, those aren't, economic paradises. They're hellholes. And invariably, you'll find that when countries finally either have a change of leadership or the leadership changes its minds, they realize that, gee, the only way we can get out of this is to resort to what you and I would call capitalism. I've never heard of an instance where capitalism, messed up a country and impoverished it, and then socialists had to come in with socialism to fix the problem. Never. We laugh at that because it's so absurd. It's unthinkable. Never happened. But I can think of many examples where socialism screwed up a country, and then sooner or later, in order to recover, it's capitalism they have to resort to. And if there's interest in the Q&A to go into some examples of that, I'd be happy to. But with that, let me say that I hope you have some ammunition now. So whether you are a person of faith or not, or whatever faith, when somebody tries to make a socialist out of you by claiming Jesus was one, I hope you have the ammunition to come back and say that is patently false. So thank you all, and I would be happy now to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Reed. And I'm pretty sure there are more examples in the book. And even he's going to he explains about how Scandinavian countries, the arguments made by the socialists on Scandinavian countries, and he also gives more examples like from context of India when there is more of adoption of capitalist values in the society becomes prosperous. Now let's move to the Q&A. We have a question. In your opinion, do minimal regulations imposed on companies like a fair wage to their workers or measures to protect the environment constitute the government taking indirect ownership of the company? Should we trust companies not to worship wealth and when respecting human rights and not exploiting developing countries will often put them at a competitive disadvantage towards other companies? Or should there be a minimal regulation on all companies, thus empowering a full free market to assure that there is breaks to assure that there are breaks on corporate greed? So they're basically asking about corporate greed and regulations on companies, some regulations on companies.
Yes. Well, I am not an anarchist who believes, say, in no government. At the same time, I don't regard those who do believe in no government as the enemy at all. I always say, wow, hey, more power to you. If we ever get to where we have no more government than I want, I'd be happy to talk with you about what's left. Maybe you'll convince me. But so I do believe there is a proper role for government. And that is, for instance, to punish harm, punish the use of violence or deception or fraud when it's employed in the marketplace. And there's no question that in any walk of life, in any society, even a socialist one, there's no difference. You will have good people and bad people. The question is, well, should we say if you have a few bad people, then we need to regulate and control everybody to the maximum degree? I don't think so. I think we should devise means by which we tend to or take care of those instances where fraud or violence or force, breach of contract have taken place. We provide a court system, for instance, so that grievances can be adjudicated and harm can be determined and compensation can be awarded. So I'm in favor of all that, recognizing that, yeah, sometimes a company, and I'm not singling out companies, this is true of everybody. Sometimes there are people in all walks of life who will try to take advantage of someone else. One of the beauties of a capitalist system is you're not assigned to work at any particular place. You have the freedom to say, oh, well, no thanks. I'm going to go someplace else, or I'm going to start my own competing business. And what we should all want is a thriving, growing economy so that we have more options like that. So people can say, I can go someplace else. There are other opportunities. And you can't exploit me for long because I'm going to go someplace else. If you have a controlled economy, you usually end up limiting growth opportunities. And so that actually hurts the worker who might otherwise be able to say, see you later, I don't want to be exploited anymore, I'm going to go somewhere. But when you put a cap on growth by suffocating regulations, you actually prevent new options from appearing for workers. But when somebody commits a harm against the rights, the contracts, the choices of others, yeah, throw the book at them. But that's not a case for some general top-down central planning regime. It's a case for selective dealing with particular problems committed by particular people.
Yeah, you have also beautifully pointed out in your book that in a capitalistic country you can have a socialist society within it, but vice versa is unthinkable. I have this question came to me when I was reading you and when I was listening to you. You have mentioned during the talk also and in the book, even if we distribute the wealth equally overnight, by the next day they would be unequal because some would invest, others would spend, and some would magnify. So, but we can see that F.A. Hayek and Milton Friedman has talked about some form of libertarian redistribution to assure free society, to establish a free market society. There's some form of government involvement is there, but you really doesn't believe in any form of those kind of redistribution. Indeed, you say that any form of taxation is theft, and theft is immoral and against Christian values. So, how do you see their viewpoints, and as an economist, how do you see redistribution from the like a libertarian redistribution
Yeah.
argument?
I'm a firm believer in finding the principles you can believe in and do believe in and can defend and sticking to them. And when you start cutting corners, and for instance, if you say, well, government should be strictly in the business of punishing and preventing harm, but and then you say, oh, but it should also do some good things, like if my city council thinks that it could make money by going into the pizza business, why shouldn't they do that? Even though there are private pizza makers, why do we need government in the pizza business? As soon as you start going down the path of, well, let's not limit government to a prescribed function, but rather let it do things that some people claim, or government itself claims, would be good. Well, then that is a slippery slope like you wouldn't believe. That's the slope that so many civilizations have gone down, where they say, oh, we really don't mean what we meant by those principles. Let's make plenty of exceptions. Well, then forget the principles then, because everything becomes an exception. Everybody will claim, do something for me. It's only right if you're doing something for them. So I think every person who says, well, let's let it do some things in addition to its defensive function, they have to tell us, well, how are you going to stop it? How are you going to limit that? Because you've just driven a truck through a pretty small opening there, and you've ripped it wide open, and now you're going to tell us, trust us, we'll keep it limited. Well, that's the age-old struggle. You start down that path, you abandon principle, and someday you'll wish you had never done so. So I hope that may not have been a good answer, but that's what came to mind.
It really made sense. I also noticed that you have empirically stated that there is a resurgence of socialist ideas among Americans, like younger Americans, and there is also a parallel trend of rise of atheism or like abstinence from like religion. They are not moving away from religion in the Western societies, especially. People are moving from religion, and there is also like an affinity towards socialist ideas among the youth. How do you see this trend? Do you see some kind of correlation or like some relation between these two trends?
I wonder, Vinny, can you restate that? I didn't quite get the first part.
So I was wondering if there is some kind of a correlation between reduction in the faith or religious values among youth in the Western societies and the rise of this appreciation towards socialist ideology.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I only caught part of that. I'm sorry, I have to. Could you try again to summarize
Okay.
that? I'm not sure I
Oh,
got.
so, is there any parallels between the trends in the rise of socialist values among youth and the reduction in the um, belief in faith? Like, so in youth among Western societies, there is a reduction in practitioners of faith, right? Like Christianity, for example. So, do you see any kind of a parallels between those two trends? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Um, it's historically, it seems that I don't know if this is part of human nature or just a recurring thing that can't otherwise be explained. But it seems that people so often, whether for good or for ill, have to have something to look up to. And there are those of us who say, well, the best authority figure is God and His Word. If you put man in place of God, it's very problematic to expect good outcomes because humans are not anywhere near godlike, and they have their own individual personal motivations. And the whole struggle for human liberty for ages has been to try to get power out of the hands of individuals, because, like Lord Acton told us, power corrupts, and the more of it you have, the more corrupting it'll be. So I guess I would say to people, if you, when it comes to your faith, whether you believe in a creator or not, be careful not to put your faith in fallible human beings. I mean, you can put a lot more faith maybe in yourself, because you know yourself better than you know anybody else, and you know what your capacity might be. And so there's reason to have faith in your own abilities. But the more faith you put in the abilities of people you don't know as well, and the more expectation that you have that they should do things for you, you're just going to hand them the kind of power they need to do things to you. I think it was Bill Buckley or Milton Friedman said that to the extent government can do anything for you, it's only because of what it can do to you. So just be careful you don't put too much faith in fallible, power-seeking individuals.
We have one last question. Has your Christian faith informed your political opinions or ideas about economic freedom and how countries should be run, or where the main reasons of secular nature and Christianity just happen to contest within it?
Oh, good question. No, I would have to say I was a libertarian before I was a confirmed and practicing Christian. And I even went through a phase of atheism, or at least exploring it, and then deciding that I didn't think it was valid. But I grew up in a home where my father was very anti-authoritarian in a very good way. I mean, he taught that, hey, stand on your own 2 feet. And he was always complaining about meddlesome government. In fact, I've often told the story about how we smuggled milk from Ohio into Pennsylvania. There was a law that said you couldn't bring milk in from Ohio and sell it in Pennsylvania for a price higher than the milk controlling authorities in Pennsylvania. Well, my dad thought that was ridiculous, and so he deliberately broke the law. Every Saturday we would drive 10 miles over to Ohio to buy cheap milk and bring it back and sell it to the neighbors in open defiance of the law. Well, that taught me that, doggone it, I don't think we have to abandon our conscience. That's so obviously stupid. Why should we say, oh, even though conscience tells me one thing, I should do what the politicians tell me, even though it makes no sense? So I was brought up with that kind of a background. So I was predisposed to libertarianism before I even heard the word. But later I wanted, as I explored Christianity, I thought, well, what did Jesus have to say about any of this? And the more I delved into it, the more I realized that Christianity is not incompatible with libertarianism. If Jesus were with us today and he was asked, how would you describe your political philosophy? First of all, he'd probably resist that by saying, I try to stay away from politics. But to the extent he would give you a word, I think it would be libertarian. I don't think there's any incompatibility between the two. But I have no hostility towards those who may be libertarian but aren't Christian. That's a personal choice, entirely up to you.
It was a beautiful answer, and I also personally had that question. There is no doubt that your book is a great weapon in defense of liberty, even if you are a believer or not. And I thoroughly enjoyed the session. I hope everyone who joined us enjoyed the session as much as I did. I think we can end the session. Thank you so much, Professor Reed, for joining us, and thank you so much, P, for helping organize this, and thank you so much, Jan, for managing all the technical parts of the session.
Oh, my pleasure, and thanks to you and to Jan and to SFL. And I just wanted to say one last quick thing. Don't forget the Prague conference at the end of April that SFL is sponsoring. And I would urge all of you, if you haven't already, to visit the FEE website, fee.org. And I have a website too, where everything I publish, whether it be at FEE or elsewhere, appears. And that's lawrencewreed.com. Thank you.
Thank you very
Jan
much.
has also dropped the.
And Will
of the
we
next on the no.
we will see you at the next session in 2 weeks. That is on February 25th. And the first session is again with Professor Reed. That is easy to remember because that is March 11th again, so exactly a month from today. So we will see you there as well. Thank you, everybody.